Welcome back to College Hill Farm. Well, here in the middle of a thunderstorm, trying to get my tractor shed built, but you know, we're in a thunder system. Now, if you notice the title, bees are not as important as people think, especially the European honeybee. Let's talk about that. The extinction of the honeybee will not cause the extinction of mankind. Okay? Right up front. If you disagree with me, write a manifesto in the comments. That's okay. Growing up as a kid, we raised honeybees. We had, 3 or 4 or 5 stands sometimes, depending on how many bees we had at the time. And of course, they were at the back of the field. That was where they were kept, at the back of the field to pollinate stuff. But the truth is, most of the things that us homesteaders grow don't need bees. Okay? Most of the things that homesteaders grow don't need bees. Let's talk about that. Now, I know that people are going to say, the USDA said that if the bees went away, it might collapse our farming system. $1.2 trillion or something like that. If the bees became extinct in North America, what would it affect? Well, it would affect apple trees. It would affect pear trees. About all fruit trees need the bees. For example, cherries are not self-pollinating, so you can't take a cherry blossom off of your cherry tree, most cherry trees, sweet cherry trees. Some sour cherry trees are self-pollinating, but we'll get to that. You can't take a blossom off your cherry tree and dab it on the other blossoms and transfer the pollen and make cherries. You can't do that. It takes something going from one cherry tree variety to another to make that. Peaches are another example of something that requires pollination by insects, whether it's bees or other stuff. Now, if the European honeybee disappeared from North America, we still have a lot of pollinators. Don't be confused. If the bee population in North America collapsed, yes, it would hurt our industries that do things like nuts, almonds. The almond industry would be hit hard. The apple industry would be hit hard. Pears, hard, very hard. Most of the trees and things that put out a seed will be hit hard. It will affect the trees too, as far as putting out new seeds. Okay, does that make sense? The honeybees will affect that. But before Europeans came to America, there were no honeybees. There were no European honeybees. But crops were already being grown. Most Native American cultures were farmers 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. Okay, they had moved away from hunter-gatherer societies. 14,000 years ago, man was cultivating marijuana. Okay, he was cultivating cannabis 14,000 years ago, before he cultivated wheat about 8,000 years ago. Alright? So, yeah, that was going on. There was all kinds of farming going on here before the European honeybee made it to North America. Remember, what was the Native American crop? The 3 sisters: corn, beans, and squash. what the hell do you think was pollinating that squash? Squash requires a pollinator, an insect pollinator, because it has a male flower and a female flower. What do you reckon was pollinating those? The Native Americans weren't pollinating them. Okay? We have a lot of other pollinators here, but if we extinct all of our bugs, we're not going to be doing good. But there are a lot of pollinators here. Wood bees, bumblebees, believe it or not, wasps. Wasps don't carry pollen from thing to thing, but if a flower has both the male and the female parts inside the flower, when a wasp flies in looking for another bug, and they do that all the time, it shakes the flower and it moves the pollen. Okay? And it fertilizes that. We call it buzz fertilization. Okay? Honeybees are better at it than wasps, but wasps still do it. Also, we have some bugs, some beetles that get in the flowers, and they pollinate. They especially love to pollinate things like carrots and beets and things like that. They're a little yellow bug. They're a yellow long beetle, and they'll pollinate your carrots for you and your onions. Okay? So let's talk about some of the other stuff. Okay. Now, what are some of the crops that you grow? Now, this goes right to the idea of prepping. Now, homesteaders are preppers by default. Okay? Whether or not we follow that lone wolf prepper idea of storing up guns and all that stuff, we're preppers by default because we use heirloom methods, okay? Heirloom methods to store our produce that we grow and the meat that we grow, okay? The truth is, most farmers in America are grass farmers. You go, what? Most farmers in America are grass farmers. The reason being, hay. Okay? All the meat we eat eats hay, including rabbits. Okay? All the meat we eat eats hay. We eat herbivores. We don't eat carnivores. We don't eat omnivores much. We eat pigs, and I eat a raccoon every now and then, and a groundhog, and of course a groundhog is a herbivore too. But I don't know if they would eat meat or not, but they might. I'll just say that at least they're mostly herbivores. So we eat herbivores. So most farmers are grass farmers. Grass does not need bees to pollinate. The wind pollinates grass and makes the grass seed grow. Okay? The wind pollinates grass and makes the grass seed grow. Corn. Corn does not need bees. The wind pollinates corn. The wind pollinates wheat. Alright? Does that make sense? Oats and barley are pollinated by the wind. Tomatoes have both male and female flowers inside them. Now, tomatoes can have a better crop if bees come by and buzz in the flower, and that makes them do their thing. Beans. Green beans, snap beans, whatever you want to call them. They're generally pollinated before the flower ever opens. They're self-pollinating. That's why you can save bean seed so easily and it's never going to cross hardly. That's why peas were such a great crop for Mendel when he did his genetics experiments. Okay, and came up with the squares for the genetics. Because in order for a pea to be crossed, you have to go into the flower before the flower opens. By the time the flower opens, the pea or bean is already pollinated. Okay, doesn't need bees or stuff. Bees can help, but About the only time a bean changes is if a bug digs in before the flower opens. Then they could cross-contaminate. But if your beans are all planted in a row together, the chances of that same bug being over on another bean are slim. Okay, so I'm not saying that beans can't cross. I'm saying that beans cross when you want them to. Peppers. Peppers are another one. They have the male and female parts both in a pepper plant. And when the wind shakes the pepper, that pollen dislodges and the peppers become fruitful. Okay, that's part of what happens. There are some more. Let's look at how many more there are. Yeah, that ought to be making, you hear that thunder? That ought to be making a nice potatoes in my fall potato garden. Okay, back to it. Now, cucumbers. Cucumbers can make fruit without bees, but generally they can't make seeds. So if you want to get cucumber seed, you're going to have some way to pollinate those cucumbers. Wind pollination will do some, but it ain't going to do a whole lot. Okay, there would have to be a lot of cucumbers in the same place for wind pollination to do much at all. Rice. Rice is wind pollinated. Spinach is wind pollinated. I wrote out a list because I can't remember all of them. Wheat is wind pollinated. Okay? Those are all wind pollinated crops. So they don't require bees at all. So what's that going to do to our food system? Okay. Now we've got some other things. Potatoes. Now when we grow potatoes, or when we grow any root crop, let's say potatoes or rutabagas or turnips or beets or any of those root crops, then as long as we've got seed, we don't need bees to grow them. But without bees, you don't get seed unless you pollinate them by hand. Okay, carrots, parsnips, all those root crops, and I'm trying to look at all of them. Mustard and kale and lettuces and all of that are generally pollinated by bees. But it's not necessarily the honeybee. There are a lot of bees and flies. There's something called a diptera, which is a fly. Diptera's a type of fly. We have all kinds of flies that frequent flowers too. So the honeybee is not the only pollinator. For example, if you go out and in the spring, and I go out here and look in my beds of dead nettle. I keep dead nettle in the spring for the bees. But you go out in the spring and look at the dead nettle, there are more flies blowing those flowers than there are bees. And the flies transfer pollen from one plant to the next. Okay, there's a lot of flies. Have you ever looked inside your pumpkin flowers? Pumpkins are another that need bees. Have you ever looked inside of a pumpkin flower? Are bees the only insect in there? Generally, the male and the female flower both have all kinds of insects in them, not just bees. Before, when Native American man was raising his crops, and his main crops were corn, wheat. Okay, they were raising grasses to eat. Corn, wheat, beans, and squash. Squash was one of the three sisters. They grew together. But what was pollinating them? There wasn't no European bees here then. It was any other bug that got in there. There are all kinds of bugs that can pollinate these plants other than European honeybees. All right? It will not be the end of society if the honeybees collapse. The United States will probably lose $1 trillion in market share of the things we grow. China has this problem already in a couple of provinces. There are no bees. The bees are gone. And I don't know for what reason, but the bees are gone. And what happens? They hand pollinate their pears. Okay, there's a whole village that spends their time hand pollinating pears in the spring. They hand pollinate their pears with a feather. You can see other people hand pollinating stuff too in areas where bees are in short supply. North American honeybees don't do so well in Canada or Alaska. Okay, but they can still grow those crops. All right, so the honeybees are not gonna cause the collapse of society. It may change our diet some, but it's not going to cause the collapse of society. And no, Albert Einstein did not say when the bees die, we die. He didn't do it. That's not an Albert Einstein kind of thing. That's too much of an open-ended thing, and Einstein wasn't famous for open-ended comments. So I don't believe he said that. I believe that's bullshit. I believe it's made up. You can't believe everything on the internet. Okay? Now, there's a whole class of plants that require pollination either by bees or some other insect, okay, in order to make seed. We talked about potatoes, and garlic is another one. It's one of those root crops. Celery, Brussels sprouts, turnips, rutabagas, lettuces, beets, potatoes, onions, garlic, mustard, cauliflower, and kale. In order to make seed, so that you have seed to plant back, those have to be pollinated. Now, most of the time they're pollinated by insects, and they're not always honeybees. Honeybees can pollinate them, and honeybees do pollinate some of them. But I've found more beetles on carrot flowers than I've found honeybees. I don't know about you, but I found way more beetles on climbing around on carrots to save carrot seeds than I've ever found on honeybees. Turnips, when they flower, you know that pretty yellow flower in the spring they put out? Turnips attract the bees. There are a lot of bees and a lot of flies are attracted to turnips. So there are flies there too that are helping with the pollination. So it's not just the European honeybee. But some of the things that are needed in order to produce fruit. Let's talk about that series. There are some things that need to be mechanical pollination, whether by a bee or by us or by some other method, that needs to happen in order for them to make fruit. All right? Strawberries, gooseberries, huckleberries, summer squash, winter squashes, including pumpkins, cantaloupes, watermelons, fava beans, the broad beans, currants, raspberries, pears, peaches, plums, sweet and sour cherries, apples, sunflowers, and strawberries. Those have to be pollinated by mechanical means. That can either be a bee or an insect or something like that. Now, let's talk about the overall impacts. If we lose the bees, there's going to be a big impact on agriculture. Okay? Some agricultural products depend on the European honeybee. They even bring stands of honeybees onto their property in the spring when the trees are in bloom. Okay? The coffee industry, okay? Coffee beans, wouldn't bother me if coffee beans went away, but I don't want to extinct nothing, okay? I don't like coffee, in case you haven't noticed. Crystal likes coffee, though. It might hurt her feelings, so it'd be okay. Crop yields are going to be down. The loss of the European honeybee would mean that crop yields in the United States would drop. pretty well. Some crops would do really well and some crops wouldn't do that well. So there would be agricultural losses. We wouldn't be out of bread. Okay, wheat doesn't need honeybees. Economic costs. It would almost put some farms out of business. It would raise the price of certain things like apples and fruit and nuts. It would raise those prices considerably because what the bees do, man would have to do. We would have to come up with a way to pollinate those things ourselves. China does it with their pear crop. You can look it up. There's a couple of videos about how China hand pollinates. A lot of people hand pollinate in other places. A lot of people hand pollinate their squash, but on a large agricultural thing, that would be a tough thing. Now, since probably, I don't know, since the American Revolution, we've had all kinds of European honeybees on this continent. They were brought over long ago, and for over 200 years they've been here, and they have contributed to the tree population and the ecosystem. They have allowed some species to become dominant that never would have become dominant species because of that. So our ecosystem will revert back. So there will be changes to our ecosystem, our natural environment. The trees that don't need bees as much will flourish, and the trees that need bees will decline. Okay, that's going to happen. So there will be an ecosystem disruption. That will also cause a ripple effect downstream. That happens. It will cause a ripple effect downstream, and so the things that feed on the trees that need pollination that have come to depend on the honeybee, the things that feed on those trees will also decline. Does that make sense? It'll cause big changes in plant communities. Some of the weeds in our hayfield will go away because they need bees to pollinate them. Something like Joe Pye weed or something like that. A lot of things are wind pollinated. So, okay, a lot of the weeds are wind pollinated. That's why they're so damn successful. Okay, so yeah, there are going to be all kinds of pollination challenges. We're going to have to figure out how to economically pollinate these things if we want to keep them in our food system. But the truth is, our food system may change quite a bit. In the colonies, before they brought over the bees, wheat was the thing. Everybody ate bread. Bread was the number one component. Bread and beer were the number one components of the diet in 17th century America. Okay? Corn became a thing because it didn't require bees, but wheat and corn and beans and peas, okay? Peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in a pot, 5 days old, or whatever the little saying was. It's because it didn't require the bees in order to make the peas. Okay? The beekeeping industry will be destroyed. There will be no beekeeping industry if the honeybee collapses. Okay? The North American honeybee could collapse, and it would totally collapse the beekeeping industry. Okay, in the last 200 years, our other plants have come to depend on bees. Now, our soil health depends on the plants that are on them. Believe it or not, your soil health depends a lot on the plants that are on your soil. Farmers plant cover crops. They depend on some of the weeds that are there to hold the ground so that it doesn't go away, and the loss of the honeybee may impact some of that. It won't impact it as much as you think, but it may impact some of it. Soil health is tied to what's growing on it. All right? Soil health is tied to what's growing on it. We need to do things to support the bees, but we also need to be doing things to support native pollinators. I know the wood bees are eating your barn up, okay? But they're probably one of the, if you don't have a honeybee stand on your property, the wood bees are probably the #1 pollinators in your field, okay? We need to be doing some things to support them and doing things to deter them without killing them from eating our stuff. We need to come up with adaptive systems to do that. An example, I leave wasps alone unless they're in my walkways or where I sit or that kind of thing. If I've got a wasp nest on my porch, it's got to go. But if I've got a wasp nest on the second story of the eave of my house, I let them be. Because the truth is, I've seen more wasps in my bean patch hauling off bean bugs than I've had problems with wasps stinging. By a ton more. Ball-faced hornets, well, that might be a different subject. Okay, but wasps, they are little predators and they take care of a lot of my ecological problems. I try not to spray because we need to support our honeybees and we need to support our local indigenous pollinators. If we need to come up with ways to support those. So, where does that leave us? The downfall of the honeybee. Get off me, Skeeter. The downfall of the honeybee will not be the end of mankind. It will not be the end of agriculture. We've got a lot of things that we grow and eat that can be pollinated by hand. Most of the things that we grow and eat, and most of the things that they were eating in the 17th century, were wind pollinated. Okay? Wheat, corn, beans don't need pollination to get seed back. Tomatoes, if you go through and you shake your tomatoes every now and then to make sure that those flowers they're pollinated. They don't need all that. I've never seen a lot of bees at my tomato plants, but I have seen quite a few of the little bitty flies going in and out of the tomato leaves. So buzz pollination is a thing. Peppers are the same way, and eggplant. So our diet will change some. Our economics will change a lot. The European honeybee has become part of our economic strategy. Areas that can't support the European honeybee don't grow the crops that we do. Okay? So get ready for that. If we screw up and extinct the honeybee, it's possible we'll kill off a lot of our other pollinators too at the same time. But it's not inevitable. Okay? If the honeybee collapses, let's say there's some kind of mite or some kind of disease that hits the honeybee population, it will hurt our agricultural industries bad. It will hit them hard. But it will not collapse agriculture. Okay? We could have a trifecta of something else that did that. But for the most part, the loss of the honeybee will not collapse agriculture. It will make agriculture tougher, but it won't collapse it. Now, if you like this stuff, this homesteading, do-it-yourself kind of thing, be certain to come on out to the channel and subscribe. We do this homesteading stuff every week, sometimes once, sometimes 5 videos. Just depends on what's going on in the homestead that week. Now, if you hit the little bell, it's right up here. When you come to the channel, it'll notify you when we upload a video. We upload on Sundays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. Now, it's time for me to get on to the next thing, and maybe this rain is passing up. I can get back on my tractor shed build.